be able to maintain itself as a gold hub in the wake of this, or whether the World Gold Council and others will turn elsewhere. And that may just be a continuation of something that we've been seeing in recent years, with more attention being paid to the East and some of the new gold markets that are propping up in China. But still, this might be an acceleration of that process. So there's still a lot to be decided when we look at this, and it's by no means certain, what the long-term ramifications of this is going to be financially speaking.
Now, what about the effect on globalism? I know you talked about recently about how Brexit was not necessarily the end of globalism, but it was a important move towards defeating globalists. Am I capturing your perspective correctly?
I suppose so. It's difficult to encapsulate in a sentence or two, because I think the vote itself is not what actually matters. It's more the motivations and the consciousness behind that vote, so that we can see a way forward for those interested in centralization, in strengthening the European Union, in more globalization. We can see a way for them to actually use what is happening right now with Brexit to further their plans, as contradictory as that might seem. Or, of course, if the opposite had played out and the vote had been for the UK to stay within the EU, obviously that would have benefited those interested in globalization as well. So I guess the real question is, well, then what fundamentally contradicts that tendency? And I think it has to be the idea of decentralization. That has to be the key part of this. And I'm sure that's what motivated a lot of the Leave vote, but certainly not all of the Leave vote. And I think those who voted Leave simply so that they could wrap themselves in the Union Jack and parade around their nationalism haven't really grasped the fundamental concept here, which is about collectivization and centralization of control versus the individualism and decentralization of control. So again, it depends how this process plays out politically. I think it's the right vote, not necessarily for the right reasons. And ultimately, it's the reasons that underlie it and the political impetus that is behind us that will determine whether this is ultimately a boon for globalization or a real finger in the eye of the globalists.
Now, when you say it was the right vote, but not necessarily for the right reasons, can you expand on that? I mean, why do you think people voted to leave the European Union, and why do you think those reasons were not the right reasons?
I think that a lot of the debate, certainly as it was portrayed in the mainstream media leading up to the vote, centered around a couple of issues, one of which was immigration and UK's growing distaste for the European Union's lax immigration policies and the migration crisis and how that was being handled. And the other was the idea that the money that is being paid into the EU by the UK could now be used to fund the NHS, the National Health Service. So basically it would be free healthcare for everyone because we've left the EU. Again, I think that misses the fundamental point about this, which was articulated quite well by Ambrose Evans Pritchard in The Telegraph just a few days before the vote took place. He came down on the side of the Leave vote, and he put it quite bluntly and quite well, that this fundamentally is about the idea of determination, of sovereignty, of taking the political power out of these unelected bureaucrats' hands, thousands of miles away, and trying to bring it closer to the people. That has to be the key point of this, because one thing that most people don't understand is that nationalism is not the opposite of globalism. It is not fundamentally opposed to globalism. It is really just a nascent form of globalism. First, you consolidate power and control in a centralized nation state, and then those nation state controls are given over to regional governments, and then those regional governments combine to form some sort of global collective. And I think the emphasis has to be on individuality, decentralization, and trying to get those forms of political and financial control out of the hands of any collective authority, whether it's national or global. So really, again, this comes down to the ways in which the crisis and its or the perception of a crisis from this vote are used as propaganda to try to scare the masses back into line and into the idea that they require this type of super state, nanny state watching over everything by unelected bureaucrats in order to keep the markets calm. And if they can maintain that sense of crisis, I think there is actually leverage and momentum on the side of the globalists.
So do you think there's a chance that Brexit could possibly be stopped, like they could do a revote or anything like that?
It is foreseeable. At this point, I don't think any of the options are necessarily off the table. I don't believe that the petitions that are going on right now will necessarily lead to a revote. But they certainly indicate that there is widespread political momentum behind that idea. And even if it doesn't lead to a revote directly, then we could imagine that this plays out in the next, at the very least, in the next general election in the UK, in terms of kicking out the Tories, bringing in kicking out the current party, bringing in the Labour, and Labour promising to get back into the EU and restarting a negotiation process. So that could play out. Or depending on how the negotiations, when and whether the government decides to hit the Article 50 button in the Lisbon Treaty and actually start the process of negotiation, how those negotiations could turn out in any way. There's no prescribed limits to what types of negotiations are on the table. It is perfectly conceivable that the UK could even leave the EU in name, but in name only, and still maintain a relationship with the EU that is, for all intents and purposes, maintaining membership in the EU. So again, there's really nothing that we know about how this process is going to turn out at this point, and it's certainly conceivable that the UK may remain in one way or another some integral part of the European Union.
Now, you were talking about some scare tactics that can be used, I guess, to kind of show people, oh, maybe Brexit wasn't such a good idea after all. Now, do you see maybe that, like, globalists could actually influence the economy and maybe actually start, for example, another economic crisis in order to just show people, look what Brexit can do. Don't do this again. You know, it kind of teach them a lesson. Do you see them trying to do that?
I do think so. I would just reframe that slightly differently to say that it's not that I believe they have to start some sort of destabilization process. I think that we have seen, especially since the Lehman crisis and the last 8 years now of absolute insanity in the markets, I think that the day of reckoning for that insanity is coming. And I think that the people in positions of power know that that is coming. So all they have to do is to let it play out as it would anyway, and then blame it on Brexit. I think one very predictable result of this is that absolutely any destabilizing event, politically or economically, that we see play out in the next months and years as this process unfolds is going to be blamed on Brexit. There's just no doubt that they'll try to use that as much as possible. And we've already got the first indication of that just from a couple of days ago. George Soros went in front of the European Parliament to deliver a speech in which he was saying, warning basically about the financial Armageddon that's about to be unleashed if the UK proceeds with this. So we're going to have to try to restructure the global economy and all of this type of rhetoric. It's already being thrown around, and by people who are in a position to greatly influence what is happening in the markets themselves. So I think again, the fundamental underlying question hasn't really changed in terms of how does this play out in the markets or the economy. For the last 8 years, the markets have been 100% tied at the hip to the central banks and the central bankers' decisions, whether the liquidity gravy train keeps flowing or not. And Mike Maloney of goldsilver.com displays this chart in a lot of his videos that's absolutely puts it in point blank, undeniable terms. He shows the St. Louis adjusted monetary base, which takes into account the combined reserve holdings of the banks in the Federal Reserve banking system. And he compares that to the Wilshire 5000 total market full cap index, which is a measure of the overall value of all the American stock market indices. And there is no doubt that before the Lehman collapse, there's no relation between those two numbers. We see a steady but very slight incline in the adjusted monetary base curve. It's going up from a couple $100 billion in the early 1990s to $800 billion in 2008, 2009. And then after Lehman, with all the liquidity injection that the Fed was doing and all of that, or most of that money being parked at the Fed, we see the adjusted monetary base going from $800 billion to $4 trillion. And exactly lockstep in line with that at every stage is the Wilshire 5000. From 2008 on, there's no doubt that the fundamental underlying driving part of that market rise that we've seen in the last 8 years has been the injection of liquidity in the Fed. And I think we see a similar phenomenon taking place with the ECB, with the BOJ, with all of these other central banks that have been following in the Fed's footsteps with their own quantitative easing programs. So the only question is when and how they put the brakes on or try to reverse that liquidity injection of the last 8 years. That is when we can expect to see the markets starting to fall, which is exactly why in the wake of Brexit, everyone is waiting to see what kinds of injections the central banks are going to do. And that's, I think, why we start seeing this rally, is because people know that, like we've seen for the last 8 years, bad news is good news for the markets, because it means that the central banks are going to kick in with even more money. And lo and behold, wouldn't you know it, now the European Commission has just authorized Italy to begin a 150 billion euro bailout liquidity support program for its teetering banking sector. So once again, the central banks are continuing to supply the grease for the wheels that will keep this economy functioning. But as soon as they take that out, it will start to collapse. And I think they understand that. And that's where the real power over the markets lie.
You mentioned George Soros, and I recently heard, a couple of weeks ago how he was saying he, is selling some stocks and buying gold. And this was before Brexit happened, and we saw Brexit happened. We saw the stock market fall and gold go up. And now he's saying that he's shorting Deutsche Bank. Now, I guess, what is your perspective on what elite like George Soros are doing with their money? It seems like, at least George Soros, it seems like he's not banking on the economy to get better. It seems like he's banking on it to fail.
It certainly does seem that way, and that is not particularly surprising. I would hope that your listeners would be savvy enough to know that whenever we hear anything about the positions of people like Buffett or Soros, we should take them with a gigantic and hefty grain of salt, because obviously people like that don't generally telegraph their positions and make it well known, because they stand to make more money by betting against markets, and they can't do that openly. So we have to be highly skeptical about whatever we hear about whether Soros is long gold or short stocks or whatever it is. But I think the point, your underlying point, still holds, that when Soros says, okay, I'm going to start shorting Deutsche Bank, for example, that is going to have effects on the market. And it's interesting to bring up Deutsche Bank in particular, because just 3 years ago, the IMF specifically pointed to Deutsche Bank as the bank with the biggest derivative exposure in the world, 72.8 trillion US dollars worth of derivative exposures at that time. And that, of course, is a very precarious position to be in the post-Lehman world. And Deutsche Bank is something that I think the world's attention should be on right now, as the potential start of a domino of destruction through the world economy. And interestingly, the three banks that were listed by the IMF at that time were Deutsche Bank, HSBC, and Credit Suisse, obviously all three European banks. And the Eurozone crisis, especially in the banking sector, being particularly acute, going back to that 150 billion euro liquidity injection that the Italian government has just authorized for its banks. So the banking sector is particularly vulnerable right now. It is where it very well could possibly, the first domino could fall in whatever kind of event is going to play out as a result of all of this. And for Soros to be at least telegraphing that he's short on something like Deutsche Bank is particularly worrying, because it does point to a destabilization. And in that speech that he gave to European Parliament, he's basically warning about the fact that we are entering into these potentially financially calamitous times. And what we need, of course, is greater centralization and a stronger EU in order to deal with the problems. So it very well could be someone like Soros, who is openly and on record against towards the side of globalization, could be precipitating the very type of crisis that would then be used as the excuse to further the globalization that he's seeking.
Now, speaking of this furthering the globalization, recently there was a leaked document from German and French foreign ministers, and you talked about how you read through the document, and it seems like they're making a plan to basically make the EU a superstate. Did you want to discuss about this?
Yes, this was a 9-page document that was leaked by a Polish broadcaster called TVP Info. And this document was drawn up by the German and French foreign ministers. And according to sources, it was drawn up before Brexit happened, but they obviously revised it after Brexit to include a couple of paragraphs to talk about that. But they're basically talking about the various risks to European stability, from terrorism to financial instability and political instability. And they said, well, obviously, in order to combat this, we need a strong Europe in a world of uncertainties. That's the title of this document. And the document goes on. Again, this was drawn up by the German and French foreign ministers. It's got their name on it. It proposes a European security compact that would not only further strengthen Europol for internal EU security, and also expand coordination with the African Union and G5 and other organizations to expand Europe's influence in North Africa and the Middle East and other sensitive regions. It would also create a European asylum agency, which would coordinate a joint database and centralize the process of asylum seeking throughout all of Europe, effectively creating a combined border. And then they talk about a completed, quote unquote, economic and monetary union, by which they mean ultimately the convergence between member states, as they put it, of different strategic sectors of the economy, including the energy industry, the IT industry, also a common taxation system, which they want to work toward, and by implication, the seizing of fiscal policy setting by the European Central Bank and the centralization of that in the ECB's hands rather than the individual nation states' central banks. So that is what is being worked toward, none of which should be surprising. All of these things have been floated at different times in different formats by various players. I mean, just last December, we saw a proposal for a European border and coast guard. We've seen EU President Juncker calling for a standing army in the EU. We've seen the ECB writing white papers about how they need more powers to further wreck the economy. So none of this is surprising, but it is interesting to see it all compiled together in a draft proposal that was written by the French and German foreign ministers and handed specifically to something called the Visegrad Group of Countries. That's Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Slovakia, in a meeting that they had earlier this week. That's particularly interesting because Poland and Hungary have definitely been resisting the European Union in various ways in recent years. And in fact, just, I believe it was earlier earlier last month, Poland was specifically chided by the EU as being unruly in the way that they're dealing with various constitutional matters, and that's pretty rare for the European Union to come out and actually chide one of its members like that. So obviously, Poland and the EU, there's a bit of tension there, as well as Hungary. So it's interesting that they're handing this document, which is basically proposing in every way more centralization of control in the EU to these countries in particular. So again, nothing completely surprising or new in this document, but just the seeing of it all in one document at the same place and handing it to them in the post-Brexit world is a bit, I think, worrying for people who are worried about the creation of that EU superstate.
So do you think they will succeed in making the EU kind of like a stronger, do you think the EU will be strengthened, in the future, or do you think Brexit will basically, I know some people have said that Britain is just one of the first nations to leave and that other nations could start leaving as well. What do you see happening with the EU in the future? It's
really up to the public. And I mean that in the sense that, again, all of this is about perception. Again, the Brexit vote, if it went in favor of or against the Leave campaign, doesn't fundamentally matter because, again, both of those outcomes can be used towards furthering the narrative that we need more central power in Brussels. Again, it's about the public, their perception of this, and whether or not they're going to stand for it. If there are people in these countries that are concerned about handing even more power over to Brussels, then it really is incumbent on them to put the brakes on this process and to really make it known that they will not go along with it if it continues to go. And I don't know what form that takes exactly. There's certainly every indication that it could turn violent. I mean, we've obviously already seen a lot of violence playing out in Greece and other countries like that in recent years that have been braying at the EU yoke. And it's certainly possible that it could turn violent in other countries, but perhaps Brexit, at the very least, if nothing else, posits an example that is not violent and yet still shows that the public will not allow this to happen. And whether it's just putting the brakes on the process or stopping it completely, still it's at least progress in the right direction. And I think we have to focus on that, and we have to keep pushing on that if we are concerned about that centralization of power.
All right. Well, James Corbett, I really wanted to thank you for your time today. I guess before we let you go, did you want to share with the viewers, you're saying that if the EU gets stronger, it's really up to the people whether they want the EU to get stronger or not. I don't know if you just wanted to expand a little bit on that and let people know, not just people in the EU, but also people around the world, what they can do to make changes and make efforts towards a more free society.
I think that ultimately, this question has to do with not the overthrow of the system. I think if that is the focus, then obviously violence and bloodshed and rallying around political flags becomes the answer, which I don't think really does provide an answer. As I said before, I don't think nationalist movements are fundamentally opposed to globalism. I think it's just a different form, a nascent stage of the same collectivism, which is the underlying ideology. So it has to, again, come back to individualization and decentralization. And there are things that people can do in their own lives to work towards those goals. It has to be about extricating ourselves from this system and building up, at the same time, building up the alternative structures that we want to see take place. And that's a very long, slow, painful process. But if we don't start it now, when is it going to happen? It will never happen. So I have talked on my podcast numerous times in the past about different ways that people can affect this. From the very simple, starting gardening. I've got a podcast on guerrilla gardening and some of the incredible things that people are doing in the most unlikely places, South Central LA, growing things on the side of the road that are then shared by the community, which they've had to fight with the local city hall in order to even be allowed to do that. And it's still an ongoing political structure. And there are different places around the U.S. that are trying to put in laws to prevent people from growing gardens on their own property and things of that nature. So that's just a tiny example of the things that people can start doing, and then expanding out from there, starting the alternative financial structures and the alternative monetary structures, the alternative currencies and complementary currencies that already to a large extent exist in a lot of communities, but most people aren't aware of them or don't make use of them, which is much to their detriment, because as people in places like Greece and other places like that, Ukraine, for example, where there is massive political and economic instability, suddenly you realize, oh, we need another way of transacting with each other because this is all going down in flames. So it's better to have those, to understand what's in your community, and if it isn't there, to start creating it yourself, participating in farmers markets and credit unions and other ways to build up local economies. And then, of course, also when we look at the wider scope of things, rather than looking at international trade organizations and the IMF and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization to help regulate international structures, participating in the revolution that is taking place right now online with peer-to-peer, online, open source ways of interacting and transacting in agoristic ways that go beyond the scope of what nation-state governments and the global regional governments would like people to trade in, including, of course, cryptocurrencies and things of that nature that allow people to transact with each other without the purview and overview of these governmental structures. And again, no one of these ideas is going to be the silver bullet. It's all of them taken together and worked on diligently over a long period of time. And again, it's not a process of jumping out of the system as it exists right now all in one go. It is a process of baby steps. But again, if we don't start that process now, I think we'll lose this window of opportunity that we have to affect any sort of different, fundamentally change the system.
All right. Well, James Corbett, are there any last thoughts you'd like to add? And where can our viewers find you on the internet if they'd like to learn more?
Well, I'll just direct people to corbettreport.com, Corbett report.com. Again, I have hundreds and thousands of hours of media available for free listening and viewing on the website now. I also write an editorial for the International Forecaster at theinternationalforecaster.com. And if people do go to corbettreport.com, I just suggest they type solutions into the search bar if they're interested in agorism and alternative currencies and guerrilla gardening and these other ideas that I've mentioned, because again,